Hi, class. Welcome to my Introduction to the Middle East class. Today we get to talk about Iran, about ancient Iran, about 20th century, 21st century Iran. So I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you get as much out of it as you can. I love talking about Iran. I love talking about the topic of Middle East anyway, so I feel passionate about it, as you know. But let's get started. So let's jump in. And remember, if you would, just open with the word of prayer before you begin, pause the video, and then come back, and then let's go. All right, so I want to tell you about a book I read. If you want to know more about Iran, a book I highly recommend that I enjoyed was called All the Shah's Men by Stephen Kinzer. When Stephen Kinzer attended a book party for an older Iranian woman who had written her memoirs about a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, Stephen Kinzer was so excited to go up and talk to her because he was writing a book about him. And Mohammad Mossadegh had served as prime minister for like 26 months in the 1950s. And so Kinzer went up to her and he said to this woman who knew him, said, what do you remember about him? What can you tell me about him? And then she just got really irritated and her face became very wooden. And then she said, why did you Americans do that terrible thing? We always loved America. And he wasn't sure what she was talking about. Well, everyone in Iran knew that the USA was responsible for ending democratic rule in 1953 when Mohammad Mossadegh was prime minister. The CIA created a coup d'etat that took out Mossadegh. And so they, to this day, they still remember that. Mossadegh, he wanted democracy, but the coup replaced him with an autocratic dictator named Mohammad Reza Shah. And Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, he was the Shah's, it was his dictatorship and his brutality that created a hatred for his regime, which eventually led to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And this brought about this revolution that was led by Ayatollah Khomeini. It led to all the anti-American theocracy that and the rest of the world will start to embrace terrorism as a kind of tool of diplomacy. In fact, it was the racialism that was fueled by this Islamic revolution that created the anti-Western fanatics in many countries, notably Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda. And so, yeah, Americans, and the interesting thing is Americans had no idea what set off this bitter hatred. When the students went into the embassy, when they took over the embassy and they took the hostages there, Americans, I remember watching as a kid. I want to say I was like in third, fourth grade. And I remember it came on the news and I remember my dad talking about it. And I just remember, no, I wasn't in third grade. I was younger than that. No, I was older than that. I wasn't, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. I was in high school. But I remember talking to my dad about it in the garage, and we're just like, why? No one had any idea why the Iranians hated us. For the most part, we thought we were liked by them. And it was because no one knew what the CIA did in 1953. Well, today's lesson in discussion, I want to talk about the story that explains about the violent current now surging through the world, because it really, at least in part, started here. And I think it's a very sobering message from the past, and it's really an object lesson for the future. But before we jump in and get that far, let's first talk about the ancient Iran. Iran, at the heart of Iran was a city called Persepolis, and it just means city of Persians. And Persepolis, it kind of testified to the grandeur that Persia was at one time. And it was the capital of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes. And dang it, I keep going too far. There we go. And about the time Abraham left Ur in 2000 BC, migrants from Central Asia, what is now a lot of the countries that end with the stan, like Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, they were pushed out by marauders from the north and east, and they come down and they settle in the area called Iran. Now, when I mentioned King Cyrus, he was there at Persepolis. What do you know about him? Do you recognize that name? Well, I know you recognize the name, but one thing that I think it's important to know about him, first of all, he was a gifted visionary, a great conqueror, known for his gentleness to the subjects that he conquered. In fact, the Lord will mention him in Isaiah, and he will say, Cyrus, he is my pleasure, shall perform my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. See, the Babylonians had conquered. They conquered Israel. They carried away the Israelites to to Babylon. But then Cyrus, the Persians will come in and they will conquer. And they're the ones, it's Cyrus and Darius, Xerxes, the Esther story. They're the ones that will enable the Jews to come back. But it started with Cyrus. They will get to go back to the Holy Land and rebuild the walls to their city and the foundation to their temple and build a temple. So Cyrus had a really tolerant, all-embracing approach to life, politics, that really, I think it sprang from his faith. The faith of Persia was the Zoroastrian faith. And they believed that every human being should work toward establishing a social justice on earth. And they believed humanity's kind of locked in this internal struggle between good and evil. And God makes his judgment according to how virtuous one has been in his or her life. Zoroaster was the founder. He was later known as Zarathustra, and he lived in what is now northeastern Iran. And the Zoroastrians, they believed that they had an inalienable right to a virtuous king. And the kings were seen as kind of the representative of God, and they deserved allegiance so long as they had far. Far is a kind of divine blessing earned by moral behavior. And the Persians began to shake when Darius, the last great leader, when he lost the Battle of Marathon to the Greeks. And then Alexander the Great, he'll kind of give the death blow when he marched on Persia in 334 BC. And they rose somewhat in power again in the 3rd century, but then they were conquered by the Byzantines. And then the Muslims will reach Ctesiphon in 638 AD and conquer them. And then the Mongols, Genghis Khan, will ravage Iran in the 13th century. And then when the Mongols begin to lose power, that's when the Safavid dynasty comes to power in 1501. And I should back up and say that in 1501, it was Ismail who proclaimed himself the Shah or King of Ismail. And he declared Shiism as the state religion instead of Sunni. And to this day, if you look at this chart, this map right here, the light green is less than 1% Shiite. And you'll notice that, so all the light green and the darker green, which is about 21%, you can see that there are mostly Sunnis throughout the Middle East, but the black areas, that's where the dominant number of Shiite Muslims are. And again, it started with the Safavids, started with Ismail the First. And Ismail, the Safavids, they will establish an efficient state and bureaucracy. And they had many architectural innovations and dumped lots of money into the fine arts. For example, the Sheikh Latfala Mosque is one of the architectural masterpieces of Iranian architecture. As you can see here on the inside, very beautiful. It was built in 1615 by the orders of the Shah Abbas, the Safavid dynasty. And the rule of Ismail is one of the most vital in the history of Iran, because before he rises and he becomes the leader, Iran really hadn't existed as a unified country, at least not for a long time. It had been controlled by a series of Arab caliphs. And the dynasty founded by Ismail, it would rule for 2 centuries. and it'll become one of the great Iranian empires. And at the height of the zenith of his rule of the Safavids, it'll become one of the most powerful. And they'll rule from, as you can see here from the map, from Armenia in the west all the way to the borders of the Mughal Empire as well. And then after the fall of the Safavids in the 18th century, they were no match for the Ottomans and their gunpowder. The Qajar dynasty will rise to power. And it was still, this country was still called Persia by the Europeans, but the locals were starting to call it Iran, meaning the land of the Aryans. And they will officially get adopted, it'll get that name officially when Reza Khan will decree it in 1935. And the Iranians, I should say the Qajars, I'm sorry. The Qajars were a Turkic tribe. They were based near the Caspian Sea up there. You can see it right there in the middle. And they'll rule all the way up from 1796 after the Safavids to about 1925. And as the world rushed toward modernity, Iran will stagnate under the Qajars because they were a lot of the leaders are so corrupt. They're very small-minded kings. They bear really a heavy responsibility for the country's poverty and the backwardness that they had. And in fact, in 1848, Shah Nasr al-Din, he begins his reign. And he was infamous for his excesses. He had over 1,600 wives in his harem, his concubines, and his eunuchs. And by the way, this is Nasser's wife. And yes, that really is his wife right there. After returning, and the reason she's dressed that way, after returning from an expensive trip to Europe, apparently he was inspired by the Paris Ballet. And so the Shah ordered the women of his harem to give up their traditional clothes and to wear these tutus and white socks rising halfway up the calf there. And this attire will remain the harem uniform for the rest of his reign. And he had, of course, because he had so many wives, he had hundreds of princes, and they had access to his national treasury. And ornate clusters of jewels decorated the palaces, and they just spent all the money. Well, Shah Nasr al-Din, he demanded to be called the Shah of Shahs, the subduer of climate, the shadow of God on earth. And those who opposed him, they were shot from cannons, buried alive, burned by fire. You don't want to mess with this guy. And to support his lavish tastes, he sold government jobs, he confiscated the fortunes of wealthy merchants living there in Iran, and he imposed heavy taxes. And then when the money ran out, he sold Iran's soul to Britain. Iran was it as it is today. It was an agriculture country. It had a lot of smokers, and it was a lot of the poor farmers grew tobacco. And the middlemen would cut, dry, and package and distribute it. And a lot of them had smoked it in a shisha or a hookah, like Jabba the Hutt. And then in 1872, this guy, Barius Julius de Ruyter, the British entrepreneur and pioneer of telegraphy and news reporting, as well as the founder of the Reuters news agency, he will acquire the exclusive rights to run the country's industries. This baron will get rights to irrigate the farmland, to exploit its mineral resources, develop railroads, establish a national bank, print currency. And then in 1891, he will sell the entire tobacco industry for 15,000 pounds to the British. And under the terms of the concessions, every farmer had to sell his tobacco to the British Imperial Tobacco Company, and every Iranian had to buy tobacco at a British-owned shop. So this is really an insult to Nasser's people, to the intellectuals, to the farmers, merchants, clerics. They all revolt against Nasser. And Sheikh Shirazi, this is him, not really, but he was one of the country's leading religious leaders. By the way, I couldn't find a picture of him. He endorsed a fatwa, just as kind of a decree, a religious order, and said that as long as the British controlled tobacco, everyone quit purchasing and smoking it. And even the Shah's wives rebelled and quit smoking. Yeah, but they did keep their dresses, apparently. This is kind of what happened. It was kind of like a Boston Tea Party. That's what the tobacco revolt to Iran was. It really was what the Tea Party was to us in America. And it will usher in a new political age. So in 1896, Nasser shot to death while visiting a mosque near Tehran. And then his son Muzaffar he'll succeed him on the throne, but he'll ignore the people's cries. He'll live a lavish life like his dad, start running out of money. So what does he do? He borrows from Russia and goes into more and more debt. Well, this guy, William Knox D'Arcy, in 1901, Muzaffar will sell to this man, this London-based financier, a special privilege to obtain, exploit, develop, and carry away natural gas and petroleum. And which is interesting. It's like, why would you sell your oil rights? Because at the time, the Iranians are like, well, we don't need oil. Well, what's the point? For heaven's sake, it's not tobacco. Well, they really didn't know the value of the oil at that time. But the Brits did, especially since they were getting battleships and they were going from coal and steam to oil ships. Well, then in 1906, the people rise up, they create a democracy, and the revolution forced the Qajar dynasty to accept a constitution. It created a parliament and supposedly some limits on the king, on Muzaffar. And it made Shia Islam the official state religion. But all this will kind of fail in part because the clergy, they'll withdraw their support, and the Shah opposed it. Plus, Britain and Russia, they want to keep Persian Iran weak so they can dominate it. And then in 1908, they discover oil on May 26, which led to the formation of the 1909 London-based Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And Winston Churchill, who was a visionary, he saw a world war on the horizon. And he knew that they needed oil to power the battleships. And so the Britain government will spend £2 million and they'll buy up 51% of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. But Britain will fleece Iran from their oil. So World War I starts 1914, and then Europe is mired in the trenches of World War I. Persia will sink further into chaos, and then out of the chaos emerges a new leader, Reza Khan, or Reza Shah Pahlavi. And he will march into Tehran, he'll take it over. And like Ataturk in Turkey, Ataturk was, by the way, he idolized, Reza Shah was a westernizer. He believed that the key to progress was a national revolution, modernization, armed forces, and industry and secularism. And he wanted to create a republic. He wanted to be the president. And so one of the pre-class questions I threw out at you was, after you watched that video on him, and I said, there's an irony in what Reza Shah enforced on women when seen in the light of what Muslim extremists like ISIS and the Taliban enforce on women today. What was enforced? And of course, it was that the women were to cover, actually, he enforced that women not cover their head, whereas ISIS and Taliban today will force women to cover their head. And so he made them remove the hijab. Actually, I think Iranians, as you can see, there's different styles of covering your head. And I think Iranians cover their heads with the khador. And in 1935, religious leaders, they'll call a protest against Reza Shah's ban on the veil. And because he'll also order men to wear billed caps like the one he's wearing. So yeah, one on the right's like, no. And that really frustrated those that were spiritual because they couldn't bow their heads. They couldn't touch their head to the ground when they bowed down to pray. They couldn't do it if they had a billed hat on, especially if they're in the military. So men could only wear billed hats. Everything else was outlawed. And by the way, these two hats should be outlawed in every country, don't you think? And so one thing about Reza Shah, he was a tyrant. He learned that there was a peaceful protest of religious leaders at a mosque in Khorasan. So he sends his soldiers to storm the mosque, and they massacre 100 people. And I don't know if they were soldiers or his secret police, the Savak, but whoever it was, they killed him. And there was no further protests, at least for now. Another time, he learned that the people were really hungry in this one town because the bakers were hoarding the wheat to kind of drive up the prices. It was in Hamadan, Iran. And so he orders his soldiers to throw the first baker they find that was hoarding the wheat, throw him in the oven, burn him alive. And now this brings up a good question. So let's go back. So he's a tyrant, but he's also trying to change Iran. He replaces the veil for women, replaces the Muslim lunar calendar with the solar calendar, tries to ban the Hajj to Mecca. And in 1935, he'll change the name of Persia to Iran. What's his motive? He envisions a secular Iranian republic. And that will turn the clergy against him. And then he'll get Russia and Britain turned against him because he will open Iran to Germany. And when he does that, that's when the Brits moved in to take over the oil. Russia moves in, and eventually they'll force him to abdicate his throne to his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. And then Reza Khan will flee to South Africa, and then he'll die in 1944. And then you can see there on the right, Mohammad Reza Shah. You got to watch a video on him as well. He's the one that Ayatollah Khomeini will rise up against him and the people, excuse me, in 1979. Well, let's talk a little bit about Iran oil in a place called Abaddon. And this is important, what happens in the 1950s, and this is how the 1950s and Mohammad Mossadegh and oil are all related, and why Iran hates us. So at the Gulf's north end, the Persian Gulf, is what's called the Shah of Iran waterway. It came into existence over a period of like 1,000 years, built up by silt, running from the rivers that meet to form the Shah of Arab waterway. There you can see it right there at the corner. And I'll move in a little bit closer here, where Abaddon is right there. And notice the close proximity. By the way, notice that right there at that waterway, there's Iran, and there's Iraq, and there's Kuwait. And this little area will become one point of contention that will lead to a major war between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. Abaddon is famous for the refinery that the Brits built to refine all the oil that was coming in. And this is what it looks like up close. It was not a really impressive place. In fact, the first engineer, Anglo-Persian, sent there in 1909, he said, this is how he describes it. He said, it was a place of sunshine, mud, and flies. And he described it as totally flat, without a single stone bigger than a man's hand. And it was also among the hottest places on earth, he said he had ever been. And as you can see here, the people that worked there, they were living in squalor, whereas all the British were living in these beautiful homes. This is the staff quarters. In Abaddon, it became a bustling city of like 100,000 residents. And there was a lot of prejudice going on there. Water fountains were marked not for Iranians. Workers lived in the slums, the shops, cinemas, buses, and other amenities that were off limits to Iranians. So you can see that it's breeding some resentment there. And, on Virtual Friday, I had you guys watch the Steve Ricks video when he traveled to Iran. And I wish we were together and we could talk about what did you find most interesting about the people. And I've showed this before, and my students always say I was so impressed with how much they loved Americans. And I have to say, I agree. And so we all know, I mean, in this video, you see Iranians, there are images of Trump on the ground, and people are stepping on his face and stepping on the American flag. But when Rick Steves would talk to people individually, they're like, we love you guys. And they were just so kind and so gracious and wanted to know about Americans and said, tell them we love them and tell them we care about them. And I know when the Twin Towers came down, they were lighting lighting candles out in the streets for us. And but back to the oil. Mohammed Mossadegh, let me talk a little bit about this man. Again, his mother was a Qajar princess, and her husband came from a very distinguished Ashtiani clan and served Nasr al-Din Shah as finance minister. At 16 years old, Mossadegh, he was named to his first government post. He was chief tax auditor for Khorasan, his home province. And in the book, All the Shah's Men, Stephen Kinzer, when he writes about him, he quotes Time magazine, and this is what was said about him, about someone that met him personally. This visitor said about Mossadegh, among the men of intelligence and learning, his decorum cannot be surpassed. He speaks and receives people respect, humility, and courtesy. He may have at times treated high officials with contempt, but in his dealing with other people, he has shown warm human feeling, courtesy, and humility. Such an impressive young man is bound to become one of the great ones. Well, Mossadegh wanted democracy, equity, fairness, autonomy. What he wanted is, he said, the Brits are the UK is fleecing us of our money, and this is our oil, this is our land, we want it back. Basically, what Nasser will do in Egypt in 1956, I want to say, at the Suez Canal, or was it 1956, and he'll do the same thing. But in 1953, the CIA they don't want him in there. They're worried because he's cozy with the Russians, and that makes him nervous. And so in 1953, the American CIA did something that would affect American-Iranian relations for a long time. Here's what happened.
Time of great tension between the United States and Muslims around the world. And there is, in fact, a tumultuous history between us. In the middle of the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government. This history is well known.
I have never heard anything about the CIA, especially in 1953.
I have no clue.
Can you repeat that?
We in the United States have short memories. People in the Middle East never forget.
Time magazine made Mohammed Mossadegh its Man of the Year, and they were right. He was the most important person in the world.
And he did what a lot of Iranians strongly agreed with, make sure that Iran would keep the revenues of its own oil.
There had never been a figure from a poor country who had risen up to challenge the masters of the universe.
Harry Truman, I think, says, I'm not having any of this. This is imperialism. This is colonialism.
Churchill asked President Truman, can you overthrow this madman?
Truman says, Winston Churchill, you can go to
Ike for president, you like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president.
And then the straw that breaks the camel's back is the Soviets are coming. The Soviets are coming. Where have we heard this before?
The Eisenhower administration selected Kermit Roosevelt to carry out the coup.
He's very well educated. He's a Roosevelt, and he wants to serve his country, but he wants to do it in a secretive way.
They never had any idea that there was such a person as Kermit Roosevelt.
I was horrified by the bloodletting in the streets. 300 people died in that couple of hours.
The 53 coup is like a guillotine in Iran. It inaugurated a massive repression.
The average American doesn't have the vaguest idea that we interfered with an elected government.
If you show just a little bit of imagination, I think we'd feel pretty upset about that, and we would probably harbor that grudge for a generation or five.
I met Kermit Roosevelt after the coup. Do you really think now that was a good idea?
I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the Middle East might look today.
So here's the question. Did we learn from that mistake, or have we made it again? Now I want to show you a clip from Bernie Sanders, whether you like his political platform or not, but I think he makes a great point in this clip.
I voted against the war in Iraq. Much of what I feared would happen, what I spoke on the floor of the House, in fact, did happen in terms of the instability that occurred. Now, I think an area in kind of a vague way, or not so vague, where Secretary Clinton and I disagree, is the area of regime change. Look, the truth is that a powerful nation like the United States, certainly working with our allies, we can overthrow dictators all over the world. And God only knows Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. We could overthrow Assad tomorrow if we wanted to. We got rid of Gaddafi. But the point about foreign policy is not just to know that you can overthrow a terrible dictator. It's to understand what happens the day after. And in Libya, for example, the United States, Secretary Clinton, as Secretary of State, working with some other countries, did get rid of a terrible dictator named Gaddafi. But what happened is a political vacuum developed. ISIS came in and now occupies significant territory in Libya. But this is nothing new. This has gone on 50 or 60 years, where the United States has been involved in overthrowing governments. Mossadegh back in 1953. Nobody knows who Mossadegh was. Democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. He was overthrown by British and American interest because he threatened oil interest of the British. And as a result of that, the Shah of Iran came in, terrible dictator. As a result of that, you had the Iranian Revolution coming in, and that's where we are today. Unintended consequences. So I believe, as president, I will look very carefully about unintended consequences. I will do everything I can to make certain that the United States and our brave men and women in the military do not get bogged down in perpetual warfare in the Middle East.
If I could just respond.
I feel very, as you know, passionate about this class because I feel like there's so much that we don't know about the Middle East here in America. And there are so many unintended consequences by every choice we make. And that's why I'm so glad that you take this class, that you're taking it now, that you're learning what so many people don't know about the mistakes that we made, and so that you and your generation won't make these same mistakes. Well, one of the videos I had you watch was on the Shah. And I want to know, what is your opinion of him in light of what you saw? Remember, he wanted to make Iran a world power. He spends billions on sophisticated military arsenal. He kind of becomes a megalomaniac like Napoleon. He crowns himself light of the Aryans. He addresses the spirit of the ancient King Cyrus in this celebration of pomp and pageantry. And then in the 1973 oil crisis, he becomes very pugnacious and arrogant. He flexes his muscle and tries to drive up oil. The price drives it up. It actually goes up 400%. And they said in the video, the king of oil dreamed he was the master of the world. And you kind of get a sense, especially when Mike Wallace interviews him, that he's kind of in denial in regards to his oppression of the people. And one of his great flaws was his secret police, the Safavids. Their domestic security and intelligence service, they will reign during the Pahlavi dynasty, and they'll do a lot of harm. And by the way, just watched a documentary on his wife, who's still alive, lives in London, and she said, a lot of the things, again, this is one opinion, but to his credit, a lot of the things that were done to the people were done behind his back by the Safavids, by the secret police. And she wanted the people to know that, not everything that went bad was a result. Not everybody that was hurt and killed, imprisoned, was because of him. But there was a man, I can't remember his name, but he was the head of the Safavid police. So I wanted to know what your impression is of him, but we can't, since we're not together. But by the way, remember we were talking in our Egypt lesson, we were talking about Fuad, the king, he was the leader of Egypt at the time. He had 4 daughters. They all started with the word F. This is one of them right here. Her name is Fawzia. And he named all his daughters with an F at the front of the name to honor his mother, Fawzia. And Fawzia, this woman right here that you see, she was the most beautiful And in 1939, as part of King Farouk's plans to strengthen his influence in the Middle East, he wants her to marry the Prince of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, right there. And marriages back then between dynasties in the Middle East was kind of a novelty at that time. At least it was becoming a novelty again. And compared, so when she moves to Iran, compared to the sophistication of Cairo, Iran just shocked her. In fact, the supplies of electricity and water on the train taking her back to Tehran broke down. And this is pictures of her when she gets there in Tehran. And there's this look of fury on her face in a lot of the photographs. And this one, she doesn't look too happy in this one either. And her marriage for a time went well. She bore a daughter named Shahnaz. And then, but her husband needed a male heir and she didn't provide one. He'll divorce her. And in 1946, she'll go back to Egypt to convalesce after a long illness. And through the influence of Farouk, she didn't return, and they'll divorce in 1948. In fact, he will end up having 4 wives. The one on the bottom with the crown on her head in the left there, that's the one that you can watch on Amazon Prime. You can watch the video about her. She'll tell about him and his life. Well, Jimmy Carter will praise him, and that will, in fact, Jimmy Carter, he'll say he's done more good for this country, and that just pushed the Iranians over the edge because they were already sick of him. And then on November 7th, 1979, that's when the students jump over the fence of the embassy and they go in and they take the hostages. And when the news that they ousted this Shah, what happened is they ousted the Shah because he was really seriously ill with cancer. He came to the United States for medical treatment, and that's when the students protest against America. But his wife said that President Carter, even though President Carter kind of praised him in the public, she said that he told the Shah privately, "You got to get out of here. You got to get out of our country as soon as you can, because you can't be here because everybody hates you." And so, but anyways, it was interesting to watch that last week. Well, the crisis continued for 400 days. They kept all the hostages, and they were, supposedly it was just students that did it, but Khomeini, he gave his approval for it. Ayatollah Khomeini, he flew in, and when the Shah was ousted, he flew in on a helicopter, and the Iranian government appeared either incapable or unwilling to intercede. And the U.S., they severed diplomatic relations with Iran. They froze Iranian assets up to $30 billion. And they will not let the hostages go until, because it was an insult, as an insult to President Carter, Iran will hold the hostages until Ronald Reagan is inaugurated in 1981.
For years, this is as close as reporters could come to the former U.S. Embassy in Tehran. But now, a rare glimpse inside.
Was this where the Marine guards were?
For 444 days, this was a prison for some 50 American hostages. The 1979 takeover dramatized in the Oscar-winning film Argo. They took us to what was the secure part of the embassy.
Is it the same combination that it was?
Yes, it's the same, he said. Now it's an anti-U.S. propaganda museum run by the Iranian government. And while many in this country have grown disillusioned with the Islamic Revolution, here the anger against America still survives.
Do you still believe it was justified to hold the Americans as hostages?
Yes, he said, definitely. Every room and every piece of equipment is an exhibit.
Wow, this is a walk back in time.
A soundproof meeting room, complete with dusty mannequins. An encrypted telex machine, marked as belonging to the NSA. And the shredders staff used to destroy secret documents as students took over. A panicked moment captured in Argo.
Burn it all! Come on, burn everything!
This is where the embassy, including the CIA, would do its most sensitive communications. There's a pressure sensor here. And then inside, all the ways they would communicate with back home. There's a teletype machine, an ancient fax machine. This looks like coding equipment. All of it now the prized possessions of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Equally prized is more modern propaganda. A tacky mural tells a familiar Middle Eastern conspiracy theory, claiming the U.S. was actually behind 9/11. Well, why would we do that to our own people? They wanted to make their people believe they are in danger, he said, so they could attack other countries. What has yet to penetrate these walls is any optimism about the new diplomacy between Iran and the U.S. Could you ever imagine American diplomats returning to this embassy and opening the embassy again? You cannot trust America, he said. America is the great Satan. For Out Front, Jim Sciutto, CNN, Tehran.
Interesting. Well, shortly after the 1979 revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini, he becomes the supreme leader. And you can see here the political system. If you look on the left there, as the supreme leader, he's over the armed forces, head of the judiciary, and the state media there. And the thing is, though, he knew how to study the Quran, but he didn't know how to stabilize the economy. And in fact, Khomeini once claimed, economics is for a donkey. And as a result, the country is struggling. And Saddam Hussein doesn't like him anyway, so that he's eyeing the political turmoil in Iran. And in 1989, the overthrow the Shah that calculated that disorder and paralyzed his neighbor, Saddam, the Iraqis will come in 1980, and they'll start a war that will last for 8 years. And Iran still suffers today from the war and the poor economy. And in fact, by 2012, government sanctions from the U.S. and other countries as well, they take a huge bite out of Iran's economy. And by 2012, prices in Iran, they increased by 80%. The Iranian rial, that's their monetary system, it goes way, way, way up, or way down in value, but everything goes up in price. Well, let's talk a little bit about Iran today before we close. In 2000, so last year, in April 2019, the Iranian officials, they threatened to close off the waterway as U.S. President Donald Trump ended the sanction waivers to importers of Iranian oil. And so I wanted to show you here, this is important. If you look here, the Straits of Hormuz, you can see Iran up there above. This is a choke point in the Middle East. This is important. It's only 30 miles wide right there at that choke point. And marine traffic goes through there all the time. In fact, if you read there, it says the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes with 18.5 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum passing through each day. So you can see tons go through there constantly. That's how many barrels go through there. And so last year, there were attacks on 2 oil tankers in June, May, and then June. 4 ships attacked off one port, and then June 13th, 2 more in the Gulf of Oman. And then Iran, by July of last year, 2019, Iran began to seize oil tankers. And as a result, this is what Trump did.
These are the latest pictures showing additional US military personnel deployed to the region, a move to counter what the US says are threats from Iran. Tensions climbed on Sunday, the platform, Twitter. Donald Trump wrote, "If Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again."
In the Middle East, tensions ramping up between the U.S. and Iran tonight. U.S. military officials say that Iran attempted to shoot down an American drone that was watching the attack on the tankers in the Gulf of Oman. The Trump administration says they do not want war, but they will take any action that is necessary to secure those vital shipping lanes. Here's ABC's Julia McFarland.
Tonight, as the fallout over hostilities in the Gulf continues, U.S. Central Command now revealing the Iranians attempted to shoot down an American drone monitoring one of the tankers on fire. The MQ-9, similar to this one, was allegedly targeted by an Iranian surface-to-air missile, missing it by less than a mile. This comes as the Trump administration tries to build an international consensus behind this video, which the Pentagon says shows Iranian Revolutionary Guard patrol removing an unexploded mine from one of the tanker's hulls. Today, Secretary Mike Pompeo unequivocal.
This was taken from an American camera. This is the stuff. This is the real data. Yes, we've shared it with allies already. The world needs to unite against this threat from the Islamic Republic of Iran.
but some allies still need to be convinced. Germany's foreign minister says this doesn't prove Iran carried out the attacks, the UK only announcing their own assessments pointing to Iran, with no mention of the US footage. Well, meanwhile, Iran continues to deny any involvement. Global powers increasingly concerned about security in the Gulf, at stake access to a fifth the global oil supply. Tom?
Julia, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And so this is one of the U.S. drone that was shot down. It was like a $120 million drone. And then right after that, there were drone attacks from down in Yemen. We're not sure exactly where they came. They think they came from Yemen, but they were supplied. They attacked the pipeline, the Aramco oil company there, owned by Saudi Arabia, going through there, the pipeline, and they believe that they came up from Yemen. In Yemen, you can see in the black box, it says the drones could have been used to launch the attacks from Yemen, or said to be Houthi Qasif ones, a model supplied by Iran. And the red says that Iran was behind it as well. Well then, so January 3rd, 2020, there, with an airstrike at Baghdad, there's an airstrike at Baghdad's International Airport, and the U.S. Killed the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, General Qasem Soleimani, and the founder of the terrorist group Hezbollah. And the reason that they did a surgical strike on these men, the U.S. did, was because of the people that were killed at the U.S. Embassy attack that these men were behind. And then right after that, after he's killed, then the Iranians retaliate.
For that airstrike that killed a top Iranian general.
Our investigative reporter Chuck Gowdy has been following the late details. He's now in the newsroom with an update for us. Chuck.
Judy, U.S. defense officials have just confirmed more than a dozen rockets have been fired out of Iran into Iraq and onto at least 2 U.S. air bases in the north and in the west. We have first video now that is just being shown on Iranian state television. This is the rocket attack, at least one rocket attack, possibly a second wave, because defense officials in Iraq are saying that there are missiles still being fired from Iran into Iraq. At least 2 Iraqi military bases that host the U.S. Have been struck, or at least targeted. One Erbil in northern Iraq, the other Al-Assad in western Iraq. DoD saying more than a dozen ballistic missiles. That number increasing at this hour because we're being told that this rocket attack is continuing. Some reports these are cruise missiles being fired, ground-to-ground cruise missiles. President Trump actually visited the Assad Air Base a little more than a year ago in December of 2018. He's familiar with it. He has been briefed on this. We have not received word from the White House yet on whether or not he's going to make a statement, but his security team assembled at the White House as this rocket attack continues now on American facilities in Iraq. Alan.
All right, Chuck, we'll keep our eye on that. Of course, any word of damage or casualties, you'll be bringing that to us immediately. We'll check on that. Let's move on here locally, though. Amazon.
So one of my colleagues was called to serve a mission for our church in Idlib, in northern Iraq, and that's where one of the places where they fired the missiles in. So he had to get a new mission call, and his new mission call was to go to Indonesia after that because of that incident. Well, this brings up a good question. Why would Iran attack leading superpowers, not just America, but they've done it to the UK. They've taken oil tankers from many countries. And Avi Melamed, in his book, Inside the Middle East, he says he thinks it's to further their image as a hegemonic regional power, because they're kind of in a Cold War against Saudi Arabia. They both countries want to be in control of the Middle East. And he says, number 2, they're launching attacks on diversified targets. As long as they do that, it increases the price of oil revenues. And as the oil price for oil goes up, that they make more money. So it demonstrates that also ignoring Iran's needs and the interests that could harm the whole global economy. Well, Iran supports quite a few minority terrorist groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Islamic Jihad in Palestine, which is actually becoming more of a threat than Hamas. The Houthis in Yemen, which begs a question: is Iran a bully or Big Brother? They give Hezbollah 100 million a year. In fact, Avi Melamed says that one source he quotes that estimates Iran has supplied Lebanon, not Lebanon, but Hezbollah in Lebanon, with more than 100,000 rockets and long-range missiles, and they've been firing those on northern Israel. So how do we look at Iran? You watch the Steve Ricks video and you say, there's good people there, and there are good people there. Is the regime, the Mullah regime, are they a bully? Are they a big brother? I'll let you make that decision. But I like this video clip right here. I want to end with.
Over the past 100 years, Iran has tested the main experiments of the 20th century. It was the first Middle Eastern country to adopt a parliament, nationalize its resources, spark an Islamic revolution. Tomorrow it will no doubt again serve as a laboratory for the future. It has possessed oil and craved nuclear power, for better or for worse. Throughout their long march toward modernization, the Iranian people have fought, often bitterly, to keep their identity. The question is not, will we have to contend with Iran tomorrow, but what kind of Iran will we have to contend with? This question is key for Iranians, for Muslims everywhere, and for the world.
What a great way to end that documentary. Will we have to contend with Iran tomorrow? That's not the question. It's what kind of Iran will we have to contend with? When that woman who was writing her memoirs, Mossadegh, when Stephen Kinzer meets her and she says, why did you do that? We loved America. You know, maybe your generation can rekindle that love and that friendship that we once had with Iran. Maybe it can come back. If anybody can do it, you can do it. I know that's true, and I want you to know, I want to end, even though I haven't talked about the Lord throughout this, I want you to know that I know that he lives, and I know that Jesus is the Christ. He's our Savior. And if anybody can bring peace between two people, two nations, it's him, because he is the Prince of Peace. Of that I bear witness. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.